And welcome everyone to Brain Swap for March 11th, 2016, where today we're talking about doujinshi.
Doujinshi.
And whether doujinshi are violating creators' rights. So we should probably start by defining a few things. What are doujinshi? We're talking about fan comics and any fan work in general, fan art, fan fiction, but specifically fan works that remix a character into new situations. So you think, you write a story with characters you create, you come up with characters and you write a story about them, and then somebody else takes those characters and puts them in situations you wouldn't want those characters to be in, and does things with those characters that you're uncomfortable with.
Potentially.
Do you have rights in that situation? What rights do you have as the creator? Right? That's fundamentally the issue here, and doujinshi being a most visible version of this. But, as fans and as creators as well, a lot of us make stuff. What are our rights? What do you think?
Well, being in the US, there's a little bit more restriction, we know, on selling works,
right,
like doujinshi, that are technically derivative, which encompasses using copyrighted and then adding something to it to make it your own, but still obviously taken directly from a copyrighted.
Right, but we're not talking about stuff that's sold, right?
Stuff that's not
typically
sold
isn't sold, or stuff that's sold in tiny batches in small amounts that just cover printing costs.
So if it was sold, it would be an obvious violation.
Right.
But if it's not sold, if it's given away, then no profit is made.
Right.
Does the creator have a right to stop it?
Right.
That's a tricky one. Because as a creator, if somebody takes your work and then starts using it for a completely different purpose, a campaign for some cause that you're completely opposed to.
And that'd be a great example of this. Your the opposite political party takes characters that you created and use them to campaign for their perspective. What rights do you have? The issue here is, comes down to what ability you have in the real world as the creator, right? So I create something, somebody uses my work somewhere else. What does that mean? What do we actually, what recourse do I have if I don't like that? And this evolved out of lots of debates back and forth, and copyright law evolved out of a lot of this stuff. Patent law evolved out of a lot of this stuff to say, as the maker of something, I should be able to take advantage of that thing and control that thing for at least some length of time as the creator of it.
50 years past your lifetime.
Well, now, that's what it is now. But originally the idea was, if I invent something, then I should be able to control who makes that and thus who profits off of that for some amount of time, reasonably.
Well, that doesn't count for parody, though.
Correct.
So let's say you make something and somebody wants to parody it.
What is a parody?
What is a parody? Something that pokes fun at what is a parody?
That cuts down to it.
Yeah, that cuts down to it. So is it parody or is it not parody? On one sense, something could be parody in a positive sense or in a negative sense. Creating humor versus ridicule.
Is parody necessarily humorous?
It can be,
but not
necessarily.
Then what is it?
It runs in parallel to the original.
What do you mean by that?
Well, its characteristics have several.
It's similar to, but not the exact same as.
It's very similar, but not the same as. But only in minor ways.
Okay.
It takes the major themes
Mm-hmm.
and runs with those almost hand in hand.
Mm-hmm.
Not necessarily always hand in hand, but enough to the person who's viewing it can draw inference that this is mirroring or paralleling something that already exists.
Okay. So
whether they recognize it or not.
Okay, but it's recognizably the same thing as the creator's work. It's just not that same work. All right. So if you're parodying Harry Potter, then these kids go to magical school, they have magical powers, they go to classes, right? All those elements have to be there on some level, right?
But it may be even more than that. There may be the same number of characters. They may have names that have a different first letter, but the rest of it, or a homonym, or it references back to the original creation as a parody, where otherwise it may just be a coincidence. You know, how many news stories are there about kids going to school? And you know, there's a few, but you know, it's one of those dicey things that it seems pretty clear cut when you think about it, but when you zoom into the details, sometimes it gets a little fuzzy.
Now, when we're talking about the typical doujinshi, or the fan work that's like doujinshi, what's interesting here is that we're often talking about a work that takes those characters and some of the original situation, but often changes the situation radically. So, you know, some of the setting is there, but the relationships are often different. The way that the characters behave is often different. So characters might be more aggressive, more passive, whatever, but they look recognizably, if not the same, then you're very close, right? And same thing with like fan fiction, right? Where most people are going to read fan fiction and know that that's not J.K. Rowling, right? Or whatever is the original author. But, you know, like you said, characters are there, all that basic stuff.
It usually you'll see a break in canon. There'll be a lack of continuity.
Right.
Character, as you said, characters won't behave in the same way. There may be variations that are obviously not possible in the universe that the original creator designs. And some of those characteristics create an environment where somebody can take the characters in a new direction that the author wouldn't have intended, and it can be very entertaining sometimes. But sometimes the what can the author do? What really at some point, you know, they may agree with it or they may not, and if they're not, are their rights being violated? Well, there is some freedom of.
What rights do they have would probably be the deeper question. Now, D in the chat room helpfully provides a definition of parody. Parody in use is a work created to imitate, make fun of, or comment on an original work, its subject, author, style, or some other target by means of satiric or ironic imitation. And this is one of the key elements of understanding parody. Parody does not simply mean redrawing characters or
humor
or right. But it does mean, importantly, that it is imitating, making fun of, or commenting on original work. I mean, it's satiric or ironic imitation, right? So there is an attempt to satirize or be ironic with parody, as opposed to just imitation, or as opposed to a more typical fan work where you're saying, I really enjoy watching Spock and McCoy and Kirk, you know, argue. So I'm going to create a new situation in which they get to debate. So I can, you know, imagine them doing more of that stuff that I love about those characters. That's not satirical and it's not ironic. So, you know, parody, and I mean, I think a lot of doujinshi can be parody, but I think a lot of the fan works we're talking about move away from parody into something, and this is where it gets kind of interesting, something that has elements of an original work, but also is reusing somebody else's work, somebody else's creative output. So it's merging these two together. And so this issue comes when, you know, yes, you're remixing, yes, you're you know, coming up with something new in a sense, but you're using somebody else's content without their permission, right? Those aren't your characters. So at what point is that a version of piracy or theft or something along those lines where you're using something that doesn't belong to you without anyone's permission? And is that okay? Like, is that morally?
It's tricky because acceptable? It's hard to judge the intent of the secondary creator.
Mm-hmm.
Is it satire? Is it ironic?
But why should intent have anything to do with it? It's not their characters. You know, in other words, we don't say that if you're hungry, it's okay to steal, right? Your motivation doesn't have an impact on your on the act when it's physical property. So if it's intellectual property, why should intent have anything to do with it?
Well, that makes sense. But if somebody makes a braided bread and I make one that's a different type of braided bread, I'm still making braided bread,
right?
But I got my idea from this person, but I'm doing it differently. If I've done it differently, am I paying homage or am I stealing intellectual property? At which point, I mean, do we say that the new work is not shouldn't have some restitution or should have some restitution to the owner? I would have to say fanfic seems to lean in that direction, except for it's fiction. It's not sold,
right?
But and from the freedom of people having freedom of speech, they can make fiction. But should anybody try and sell it, I would say that would definitely be a violation of the rights of the original creator.
Okay, but even if you're not selling it, I'm trying to get down to the act itself, right? Like you're building something, but you're using somebody else's stuff without their permission.
What percentage?
Well, not just what percentage. Is it okay to use somebody else's stuff in your work without asking permission? And I'm asking this question because it sounds obvious, but at what point are you creating something new, right? And we've had this issue legally. If I take an Andy Warhol painting and photograph it, and then hang that in an art gallery, is that new? Right? Is that a new work of art? If I take a photograph and change one pixel and hang that in an art gallery and claim that as my own, right? And claim that as my own work, is that really my own work? Right? So and more importantly, and part of the problem is that I think people come at this from only one direction. Not to reference the band. The idea is, they come at it from the fanfic, from the fan's perspective, right? These things exist. I'm just making a story. It doesn't hurt anyone. The original artist is not being hurt. And Gene Roddenberry is not being hurt by the fact that I'm writing this Star Trek fanfic. Other fans aren't being hurt by the fact I'm writing this other fanfic. That's fine. But again, see it from Gene Roddenberry's perspective. Imagine yourself as a creator and then going out and seeing other people do things with your characters that you're really unhappy with and uncomfortable with.
I never wanted my character to do that.
And again, so to be absurd and extreme, imagine if the KKK used your character as a mascot. They're not making money off it. They're just using it to promote their stuff, right? They just put it up on their website and put a word balloon next to it. Does the original creator have any rights in that thing, or do they have to just stand back and say, well, they're just doing it?
Well, I don't think that there has to be an exchange of money. It could be goods or services, and that's a service of promotion. And I think using somebody else's character as a promotional would qualify as something that could be quantified.
Oh, okay, well then let's ignore that. But you get.
But I
right?
get your point. Right? Yeah, I think that at some point there is a right that the creator should have to have some control, but then there's also the balance of the freedom of the fans to develop stuff. And I think we have a big difference between US and Japan when it comes to doujinshi, because I think we're a little bit stricter here in the US for that kind of thing, where it's more common and tolerated in Japan.
Right.
But that being said, you still see some here in the US. There's digital copies, stuff like that. But it really makes me wonder, at what point does a creator relinquish control, and to what degree do they relinquish control?
And that's exactly the thing, is that, like, is there control to relinquish, right? Like, it's interesting to see, you know, the terms we use in this, because there's this assumption that we talk about, you know, giving up control or fans being allowed to do something, which implies that there is some framework of control, right? If you're taking something, it exists. If you're relinquishing something, it exists. So we think that there is some level of ownership that people have over their not their ideas necessarily, but over the things they create, right? So I write a book, I have these characters, I have some level of ownership of those characters, at least, you know, conceptually. But does that ownership, does that term ownership, does that concept of ownership mean anything if anyone can do anything they want with those characters? Right? So I have, yes, I've created these things, but if anyone can do whatever they want with them, I don't actually own that thing. It's now passed into the public domain in the broad sense of the term public domain. And again, I ask not because I think that all doujinshi should be shut down. I don't. But I'm wondering, where's that, you know, if you create something, if you create a character, do you then have no control over that character? Can you then not step in when somebody is using that character in a way that you don't like? Do you have no moral high ground, if you will, to stand in and say, well, I created that, and so I don't want you to use that? You know, in other words, we seem to be implying a world in which I can take anyone's character, use it any way I want to, as long as it's not making money. I can have them do anything, say anything, do anything, and the owner just has to sit back and take it. Is that the world we want to live in? I'm not sure.
This is a really gray area.
It's absolutely. Now in the chat room, Derpy brings up that, you know, Gainax got their start with Daikon 3.
Daikon 3
now
has a
the thing is, Daikon 3 is absolutely parody, because it was taking characters and referencing them, and, you know, the Star Wars fight in there is absolutely parody, because you have a bunny girl fighting Darth Vader.
Yeah.
And all these various things. I think that is definitely parody, and it's recognizably so. If Gainax had then gone and done, you know, a show that looked an awful lot like Gundam or Ideon, but just changed one or two things, then you're getting into more dangerous territory. Gainax has always been very thoughtful about being as original as possible. They reference a lot of stuff, but when they made a talking to a video, that wasn't just a bunch of anime references. There was an original story in there, right? And they're absolutely creating things with Otaku no Video.
Hey, I'm George Lucas, and I don't approve of bunny girls.
Right, and that absolutely gets to the heart of it. If George Lucas, you know, does George Lucas have the right? And again, understanding that's parody, but assuming it was just, you know, somebody drawing that, you know, can George Lucas come in and say, you know what, I know that you're not making money off this, but I really don't like you drawing and promoting that thing. Could you please stop? Is that an unreasonable thing to ask?
Well, I would think part of that would, when it came down to judging the material, would come to what percentage of the material is intentionally taken. Like, because in movies we often see homages to previous creators of a certain scene. Oh, that's they're using that from, and it's a chapeau. It's like a hats off to these great people who've come before us. But that's a small portion, and it's not taking the whole thing. It's just referencing back. It's not, I'm taking the guy's story, the plot, the characters, or any of that, and then steering the whole vehicle.
Yeah. So Desert Fox in the chat room asks, what if they just require no money can be made of it and must let people know it's based on the original, link to it or reference? That would certainly help. The issue again here is that we live in a world that it goes far beyond money, right? We live in a world where political ideas, religious ideas, thought ideas, lots of different things spread regardless of money being made. So the concern here is that people can use things to spread dangerous, problematic, or just ideas you don't agree with your stuff, even if there's no money being made, right? So that's part of the issue. And the folks in the chat room are bringing up the fact that 3 years ago, a Japanese man was arrested for operating a site with uploaded doujinshi in Japan. That actually has happened a couple of times. People have been arrested for sharing large amounts of doujinshi in Japan.
Can doujinshi writers slap their copyright on it and say, hey, you can't?
Not really, because it's fan work. They have, if they were to try it in court, they could certainly, I'm not a lawyer, if they tried it in court, they could certainly make some claims to being a parody work and thus. But point being, he was sharing all this stuff that he didn't really create, or he didn't really get permission to put up.
Now doujinshi creators in Japan, they can actually make money off of their doujinshi, right?
Not technically.
Not technically.
So according to, as I understand it, law, you can sell doujinshi in limited quantities in small, in limited quantities at a rate that pays for resources and costs, right? And that's intentionally defined rather broadly to say, it's not just the cost of the paper, it's not just the cost of the printing, it's the cost of getting a booth at the con, it's the cost of everything else. So it doesn't have to, you can count a lot of things there, but you can't be selling so many that you're making a living off of it, right? You're selling enough so you can go back and do it again, so you can come to the next convention and you can make the next thing. But as soon as it crosses that threshold into something bigger, then suddenly things have to change. We saw this with Tsukihime, where there was a doujinshi circle that was making fan stuff, which was so successful and so popular, they then started making their own original works because they had enough money to do so. And they could have just kept on doing doujinshi, but that would have been problematic. They had to make it more and more original to make that work. So that's the issue there. But
by and large, again, that doujinshi distribution model would be completely torn up if it was tried here in the U.S.
Well, yeah, we'd have to change our law. And to be fair, or to be clear, in Japan, that is considered part of fair use, right? They consider selling small, limited quantities in a comiket kind of environment where you only have 50 copies. That is considered a form of fair use because it hasn't moved into commercial production. We would have to absolutely affect that and do that. Yes, D, I have watched Yu Yu Hakusho. If that's what you're talking about.
Sorry, folks, my throat is. I'm getting over the flu. I'm a flu fighter.
And by the way, yes, Derpy. Lots of fan games are being sold online blatantly. Everything is being sold online blatantly. You can find anything you want. If you
it's the
search
Wild
even
West
decently.
out there.
But part of this is we do want to get to that sort of broader question of whether it's for money or not, whether it's for any reason or not. If I create something, do I have any rights whatsoever on how that is used by other people?
it seems that you would have more rights if the case where you were in the US and it was a US creator or a US person who was violating that. Now, once you start crossing international borders, that gets a lot trickier.
And it might be even more firm in other countries.
It might be more firm, or it might be less firm. If it ends up as a doujinshi, I don't know of too many doujinshis about.
Well, and let's again bring this kind of out of the legal side. You know, the question is not
the ethical.
Yeah, exactly. And the question is not what does the law say. The question is more, as a creator, should you have the right to change how people or affect how people use your work?
If I come up with a cute little character and I want it family safe and I want it to stay that way, as a creator, I would want it to stay that way. But I know that rule, what is it, 34 exists,
right?
And it's going to get out there one way or another. Does that make me happy? No. Do I want to stick it to the person and say, no?
Well, and here's the question.
Can I?
And that's exactly the question right there. Do we give up? Right? Do we say, well, Rule 34 is there, it's going to happen, and so screw it. We're just going to let it happen and walk away? I don't think so. I'm a little worried that we're walking into a society where we say, because some people do this sometimes in some situations, and it's likely to occur, that we then just shrug and say, well, we're not going to do anything about it. Surely there's something as a group that we can, you know, as a community, if you will, where we can stand up and say, no, as a creator, you have the ability to do X. But the question is, what is that X? Like, what is the reasonable solution to this?
It's tricky because it depends upon how it's being released.
And part of the problem, too, is that we have a long history of people clamping down very hard on their copyrights. Walt Disney Company, for example,
very hard,
where, you know,
and they're pretty much the king of that.
Exactly. You know, there's a famous thing where, you know, if you draw Mickey Mouse on the inside wall of your daycare, they will come in and tell you to stop doing that. That's the issue. That is an issue. You know, so we tend to err on the side of, well, that's not fair, right? And we understand that's not fair. You know, if I take a character and use it personally in this thing, where it's not a big deal, but then we don't go the other direction. We, you know, and say, well, but if you are the creator of something, surely that should give you something, some power in the world.
Tricky balance.
What should that balance be? I think it's important. And yes, there are occasionally fan stuff that gets picked up. And that's great. I think that's awesome. Does that make it ethical? Because again, that's going back to the idea that, well, because sometimes, rarely, it actually becomes accepted by mainstream, then it's always ethical to do. Yeah, I don't agree with that necessarily.
Well, as a creator, in the early stages, I want publicity and promotion.
Sure.
So as
at any cost.
See, there's the trick.
That's the thing,
you know.
And thank you so much for bringing up that thing.
Live long. Mention that. So.
Imagine you're doing a webcomic of cute, family safe characters, right? And this is aimed at like kids, for example. And then somebody starts doing a very adult comic using those characters. Should you be able to go, because that is something that impacts your brand. Like, other people might come across those characters first in that context.
And if that's their first exposure, you lose business.
Right. And not just business, you lose fans. Right. If the idea here is to get your stuff to spread, and actually that brings up even a bigger thing. Let's even move the whole money thing outside of it. Whether or not you're making money off it, whether or not it's a business, but somebody else is taking this thing. Webcomics usually don't make much money. you're making a web comic and you're putting it out there and you're not making any money off it, but somebody comes along and grabs those characters and uses them differently, right? Puts them in a different situation, but they're recognizably those characters, and they're not making money off it either, but that's gaining momentum. Should you not have rights?
What if they're more successful?
Exactly.
Hey,
exactly.
Wait, that was mine.
Right. Do we shrug and say, well, sucks to be you? Or should there be some recourse? Should there be some aspect of it? I get really, I have a friend who used to work in youth ministry, and the one word that he always got angry when people use is the word whatever. He said, no, it's your life. It's your experience. When you just say whatever, that is you giving up and saying, this is just going to,
Que sera, sera.
Que sera, sera. And while there are certainly some things you should just kind of accept and say, okay, not a big deal. But I argue that this is a case where if you ever want to create something, if you ever want to be known as the creator of something, giving up on the idea that that has any impact on the world, that anyone will ever notice or care that you're the owner of that thing, giving up on that is gonna give you, gonna cause you problems down the road. Don't you want to actually do that? That's what I submit. So yeah, and again, it's complicated. There's lots of gray areas. But I propose that doujinshi, I don't think they're necessarily violating creators' rights, but I think that they are glaring hard at them. They're not stepping on them, they're not ripping them up, but there's a potential for damage here.
It's pushing the boundary that hasn't been really pushed that far before.
Right. And we've certainly seen lots of doujinshi of existing characters put in very inappropriate situations. And that can be problematic. And there are people who I'm sure have first experienced Cardcaptor Sakura through a hentai doujinshi. That's not cool. Right?
This is based on a real work.
Right.
Okay.
That can be an issue. That can be a problem. And again, that can turn off people to that thing.
And I think that lends itself to a big stereotype that's out there among non-otaku of all anime. That's all porn and cartoons, isn't it? No. When you're searching the internet, maybe that's the first thing you see. But anime does not necessarily equal porn. And I'm constantly trying to dispel this myth from people who just have that association in their mind because it's the first thing that they hit when they search. And so I can see where it does damage to the industry, to friends, to fans, to...
And that's exactly where a lot of the stuff came, where back in the day it was like, a lot of this, a lot of hentai was being sold over the counter in America, and fans in general just kind of shrugged and said, well, if it sells, right? And eventually it'll self-correct, and it didn't self-correct. And obviously most people in America, when they hear anime, they don't immediately think tentacle porn. But it did have this lasting. There are a lot of people today that still keep anime at arm's length because they saw a lot of that at the counter at Best Buy or Suncoast or whatever back in the day. So when we say that stuff is allowed and that stuff is just going to be there, and so we let it be there, I think that can have some downsides. Now, Derpy in the chat room brings up that there's certainly a anime tends to be sexualized. There's a lot of sexualization in anime, especially of female characters. Name pretty much any shonen series, long-running shonen series, and there will be girls wearing tight outfits and guys who are not wearing tight outfits. So that certainly is there. But again, that's kind of getting too far afield into the whole sexuality thing. This is more about that question of,
that Russian girl did make me do a double take. That the anime girl, she puts herself. Oh my goodness, that was
Yeah.
what? Real life. Wow.
Yeah.
But when you see some of the photos of how she does it, it's pretty amazing how she does it. And there's several girls who are doing that now, and it was incredible to see someone who goes the cosplay route and does the makeup and has ways to make her eyes look bigger, and it really did make me do a double take. That's life imitating art there, and some of the reason that we're concerned is life imitating art, and what is art, and what is ownership of art, and the art itself when somebody takes your work and runs with it.
So Desert Fox asked this question of, so what are the ethics of stopping one fan subgroup or one doujinshi because the creator likes one but doesn't like the other, right? Or is aware of one and isn't like the other? Is that fair?
For the creator, yeah.
Right, exactly. That's my view, is that, again, does the creator have no say? Is that what we're saying?
If the creator develops a relationship with some of those fan groups, they may say, hey, I'll let you have permission to do this as long as you avoid this area or that area. I just don't want this to happen with my character. Then the fan group is on the spot to either comply or not comply. And that would be
well. And the thing is, I mean, and fan subs are different because fan subs are acknowledged to be illegal, for lack of a better term, right? Fan subbers recognize that what they're doing is taking material, and this is not allowed. And if the or when I say not allowed, it's under the law, it's not kosher. And that if the original company came to them directly and said, look, stop doing this, then they would have to stop doing it. Well, one or two fan subgroups have not followed that, but that's the exception to the rule. So I think that's a little different because you have folks who recognize that this is they're doing this as a service in lieu of other things, right? But yeah, I think, shouldn't the creator have some say in how his or her creations are actually used in real life by other people who haven't asked?
I heard an interesting argument kind of on this case, related in one way or another, saying that every time somebody cartoonizes Hitler,
right,
it diminishes the true impact that people actually had because we're making something light of it. And I was kind of divided on the issue because I could kind of see, we're making light by having poking fun of it, but at the same
Nazis,
time,
actually,
there's the parody part of this is the greatest villain of all time so far, that and so I was kind of divided on it. How does somebody animating or doing their own work or doujinshi illustrations, how does that play into the figures that are so large in the public view that it's hard to avoid? Say, political cartoons are different than doujinshi, but there's some overlap.
It can be. Although I think political cartoons are, again, very well. But political cartoons are pretty original, right? Political cartoons are making it well, and this gets to political cartoons are about public figures, and we have law about what a public figure is, and what that means. Whereas doujinshi and other sort of fan works are a little different because they're about a created work, and characters that aren't public figures in that sense. They came out of somebody's mind as opposed to just having to be there. And a political cartoon, also specifically, is a parodic work. We have had cases legally, and I don't know where they went, where people will stand up and say, "Look, I happened to trip and fall and get caught on camera, and people made these cartoons making fun of me. Stop doing that. I would like those taken down." And some people did, some people didn't. So again, shouldn't people have that right to say that, that I have a say in that? Shouldn't people be able to say that?
Yeah, if they animate me with my lightsaber,
Mm.
doing all sorts of crazy stuff.
So Liquidus asks, what about anime that never got officially licensed? How else would you see it without learning the Japanese language? Talking about fan subs here, obviously. Fan subs is hard to figure out when it can spread word of an anime, but can take it far longer. And here's the thing: you don't see it. You don't have the right to watch everything in the world, right? Unfortunately, and there's tons of awesome content out there that you can't see or you can't experience because you don't know the language. But that doesn't mean you have the right to take that and manipulate it and distribute it just because other people can't see it.
I think
it's not yours to distribute.
Is distribution.
Right.
If you have a bunch of friends who can translate it for you and they're helping you translate it, yeah. But if you distribute it to people that you don't know, that's an ethical cut and dry. I mean, you don't know these people you're distributing. And personal use versus public consumption, I think is where the line of ethics would stop at that, because these people who do know Japanese who are helping you translate, that's cool. I mean, they're helping you. You know, it's not, nobody's trying to get anything over.
It's no different than sitting in the same room with somebody who knows Japanese and, you know, they're live translating it to you, right? They're just telling you what they're saying. That's normal and kosher, right?
Yeah.
That's fine.
It's when I share it with my 8,000 friends on the internet who I don't really know by first name, last name, or sometimes even don't even know their IP.
Yeah, exactly. And similarly, as a fan, you know, you don't get to download that from somebody else just because you want it. I mean, we do, obviously. You know, we do it all the time, but that doesn't make it morally or ethically right to do so. We don't have a right to that necessarily. So yes, Master Chief, there was the Kuroku's basketball doujinshi threat. I don't know quite how that's relevant here, though.
But, a threat?
Oh yeah.
What, we're gonna do a bunch of doujinshi if you don't do something?
No, these were death threats.
Oh my goodness.
But
wow, that's not cool.
Yeah. So there are getting back to the topic, I think there is certainly something here to think about when you are taking somebody else's works and reusing them. And I've long been an advocate for fan fiction, for people writing fanfic, for people making fan art and all that stuff. I think that's great. But there does come a point, and also we should point out, there's a difference between writing fanfic and putting it on the internet, right? There's a difference between writing a doujinshi and publishing it.
Well, what if you're just sharing it among other writers on your fanfic circle?
How big is that circle?
People that that's a good question, and it, right. like all of these issues, it sounds cut and dry until you start zooming in and everything goes out of focus again.
And back in the day, fanfiction.net was this tiny group of people.
Now,
right? You know, back then it was that tiny little group of fellow fans and critiquers. So it is hard to kind of do that. But yeah, I think it is a significant moral question that is worth thinking about. It's worth kind of holding in your mind.
It's tricky because you have to think of it from both perspectives. You have to think of it, if I was this creator,
right,
what would I want? And if I was not the creator, but the doujinshi artist, what would I want for my freedoms? And somewhere there's a compromise, but not always. And it seems that if you can consider both points of view, you can come up with something that's ethically what is the word I'm looking for? Collaborative, or not collaborative.
Yeah.
Cooperative.
Oh, there we go. There we go. Exactly. So yeah, certainly there's no easy answer to this. There's no simple cut and dried answer that would be good for everyone across all time. But I hope that people don't just dismiss this topic and assume that because you want it, or because you've changed one little thing, then you fall under fair use or parody or something, and so it's okay. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. So I think that's where we'll leave it tonight. Again, I hope we've left you something with more to think about. That's kind of our goal here, is to provoke some thought. And yeah, along with talking about, I agree. You know, should size be part of the argument to begin with? Because size is a slippery thing. Is distributing it to one person all that different from distributing it to a million? Why is that different? Anyway, so we will be back next week to talk about a rather different subject. We're going to talk about the mecha genre, giant robots. And we're going to talk about why has the mecha genre faded over the past few decades? You know, the 1980s was just lousy with mecha shows. There were just mecha shows all over the place. Exactly. Yeah. And we certainly have them now. We certainly have new mecha shows, but nowhere near at that level. Why is that? What's happened? What's changed in, say, society? What's changed in fandom that may have pushed that away?
They do exist.
We'll discuss it. We'll talk about it. And maybe we'll come to some conclusions. And with that, thank you all very much for joining us. Hope you join us in the chat room while we do this every Friday night starting at 9:30 p.m. Eastern time. If you're looking for more stuff like this, please go to geekarchaeologists.com. We have lots of other cool videos up there for you to watch and enjoy. So thank you all very much. We will see you all next week.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.